A frequent point of contention within the left is the concept of imperialism. There appears to be virtually no consensus on what imperialism is, and even among those who agree on the theory, there are bitter disputes about its real-world interpretations. In most cases, imperialism seems to be a sort of gut feeling applied loosely to any particularly uneven power dynamic in the global arena. In fairness, the object of study here is uniquely complex. We are asking ourselves what capitalism's dynamics look like on a global scale. In other words, how does capitalism function in the most general possible sense? To even begin to grapple with this concern, we need to be prepared to make simplifying assumptions, lest we get drawn away into a world of infinite variations. This theoretical process is ultimately justifiable by what it produces, an accurate evaluation of the current historical constellation. By and large, the left likely agrees that imperialism exhibits a kind of extractive exploitative relation, which, in some capacity, implies a clear separation between those doing the exploitation and those being exploited. Beyond this, however, the lens shatters into a collection of disparate shards, each with their own refractions of reality. Some believe we live in a type of Kautskyan world, where the major capitalist powers have aligned into an identifiable bloc or coalition, thereby separating the world into an imperialist and anti-imperialist camp. Apart from it being rather generous with regard to the unity of the supposed imperialist bloc, this perspective also misattributes opposition to the imperialist bloc as a form of anti-imperialism. Others view the world from the Leninist position, stressing the tenuous multipolarity of global capitalism. As Lenin argued, dominant capitalist powers compete over access to profitable markets, into which they hope to pour their abundance of finance capital. But it is not very clear to what degree capitalist powers can be correctly understood as distinct nation-states. Is the imperialism of the UK and France truly separable from and in competition with the imperialism of the US? For more on the ultra-imperialism of Kautsky and the Leninist theory of multipolar finance capital, watch the video on geopolitics. Our discussion today will try to introduce additional insights on the functioning of global capitalism, drawing from more recent theoretical work. Following Lenin, dozens upon dozens of radical thinkers have attempted to build, renovate, and adapt the notion of imperialism in order to better characterize the global economy. This process of reevaluation is indispensable. After all, since Lenin wrote Imperialism, the world has experienced the most brutal war in human history, waves of national liberation struggles, a Cold War, the collapse of the socialist bloc, neoliberalization, and financialization. To suggest that theories of the late 19th and early 20th century could still adequately capture the structures and dynamics of imperialism today is to imply that their proponents were divine prophets, a position that is neither practically useful nor Marxist in spirit. One new direction has been the school of dependency theory. Working shortly after the end of the Second World War, Hans Singer and Raoul Prebisch both showed how the imperialist core and the colonized periphery exchanged goods on highly uneven terms. Specifically, the prices of the core's exports grow over time relative to the prices of the core's imports. The ratio between the prices of exports and the prices of imports is known in economics as the terms of trade. Dependency theorists argue that the terms of trade between the core and the periphery offered an immense advantage to the developed countries. To use economics jargon once again, the main mechanism at play was the income elasticity of demand for imports and exports. In short, the core's need for foreign goods is quite static over time. By contrast, peripheral countries' need for goods from advanced economies is high, and only gets higher as these countries grow. The periphery depends heavily on the core's machinery and advanced equipment in order to process the raw materials it exports. The result of this situation is that the periphery is unable to pay for the imports it needs because the relative value of its exports is in decline. Moreover, despite the high and rising productivity and exports of both parts of the world, The core has relatively monopolistic labor and capital, meaning strong labor organization or market power of companies allow increases in productivity to be translated into higher wages or higher profits. Remember that the higher the productivity, the more goods are produced by the same amount of labor power, meaning each good has less value and thereby a lower price. However, companies with the power to charge markups can effectively absorb this productivity increase, meaning prices are not actually reduced. In theory, strong unions can capture productivity gains in the same way through bargaining, though we know this to be the less likely scenario in the neoliberal era. The opposite is true for the periphery, where an abundance of labor and steep international competition for exports prevents either labor or capital from securing productivity-induced gains. Here, the political elements of imperialism matter greatly. Labor movements in the periphery have been stifled by imperial interference and comprador regimes. On the capital side, most former colonies were rigidly forced by their colonizers to become single commodity exporters of cheap raw materials or goods, which necessarily face steeper international competition. Meanwhile, core countries dominate and monopolize technological innovation. As a consequence, peripheral countries must import machinery from the core at debilitating costs just to keep their production going. The overarching picture is therefore one where the core benefits from the productivity gains in both parts of the world, while the periphery loses absolutely. Such a shift in the balance of trade suggests a drain of capital out of the periphery, with peripheral countries paying high import prices and making slim revenues from low export prices. Another position developed by later thinkers is known as unequal exchange. The two main figures here are Argyri Emmanuel and Samir Amin. Their idea is that 1 hour's work embodied in a commodity produced by an underdeveloped nation exchanges for less than 1 hour's work embodied in the product of an industrialized nation. The outcome is that value is being drained from the underdeveloped to the developed world. One important observation in this approach is that capital is highly mobile, meaning it can move from place to place, country to country, with relative ease. As such, capital will flow to places with higher rates of profit, and will do so until profit rates are equalized. Labor, by contrast, is barely mobile. Workers cannot freely move from country to country, or even within their own countries. This implies that wages will not equalize, especially across countries. For the sake of argument, we assume that material costs are the same across countries. Thus, the final price of commodities, also called the price of production by Marx, is the sum of capital and raw material costs, wages, and profit. With all this in mind, the proponents of unequal exchange conclude that the products of the underdeveloped world are consistently undervalued, while the products of the developed world are consistently overvalued. We can apply the schema Marx uses in the third volume of Capital to the global political economy in order to illustrate the drain of surplus that constitutes unequal exchange. In Capital, Marx examines two illustrative economic industries in terms of their production and returns to investments. For our purposes, we will also have two industries, one in the core and one in the periphery. They produce different goods. Let's say that the core industry employs $200 in means of production, i.e. constant capital. The industry in the periphery does the same. Of course, this is quite unrealistic. The core is much more likely to have greater volumes of capital in its production. For simplicity, we say these quantities are the same in both countries. The core pays out $100 in wages for production. By contrast, the periphery pays $66.6. At first glance, this may again seem bizarre. We would expect the core, aka the developed world, to have much more capital-intensive production, meaning that the capital-to-labor ratio should be much higher than in the periphery. However, remember that we are talking about wages. In actuality, the capital-labor ratio might be much lower in the periphery, simply because $66.6 buys far more laborers than it would in the core. In other words, production in the periphery is quite labor-heavy, but the wages are significantly more depressed for a number of reasons. As a result, $100 might buy 10 workers at a wage rate of $10 in the core, but the periphery could easily employ the same number of workers by paying them $6.6 rather than 10. Perhaps more realistically, the periphery could even employ double the workers, 20 at a wage of $3.3. Moreover, the production process in both industries yields $100 in surplus value. In Marxist terms, surplus value is the value produced by workers in excess of the wage amount. Note that the rate of surplus value, also called the rate of exploitation, is much higher in the periphery. The rate is defined as the surplus produced by workers over the wages paid to them. Another way to define this rate is the ratio of unpaid to paid labor. The rate of exploitation in the core is 1, meaning half of the effort of the workers in the core is reflected in wages, while the other half is what Marx would call unpaid or surplus labor. In the periphery, the rate of exploitation is 1.5. The value added by workers in the periphery is comparatively higher than in their core counterparts, not necessarily due to gaps in productivity, but simply because wages in the periphery are significantly lower. The workers in the periphery are more exploited. What is most important about this observation is that it implies that productivity and wages are not proportional. The convention in mainstream economics is to view wages in direct relation to productivity. In other words, the wisdom is that workers are quite literally paid what their labor is worth. However, even by mainstream measures, this is not observed in the real world. In Marxist theory, workers produce value that is divided into two categories. The first is value equal to the worker's labor power. In short, it is the value that is needed for workers to reproduce their ability to work. This is expressed in wages and often denoted by Marx as V. The second part of labor's product is surplus value. This is value over and above the amount needed to reproduce the conditions of labor power, denoted by Marx as S. Total revenue in these value terms is the sum of the value of the means of production, the wages or value of labor power, and the surplus value. The rate of profit in this table is calculated as the surplus value divided by the sum of total invested capital, which is itself a sum of wages and constant capital. In other words, the core laid out $300 for the production process and got $100 in new value. The ratio of the new value over what was invested in production is the value rate of profit. We also consider the aggregate values for each category, which is important for the rest of the analysis. Notice that production in the periphery is more lucrative than in the core. It yields a higher rate of profit in value terms than the average global rate. Thanks to neoliberalization, capital is quite mobile around the world, meaning corporations can move their activities overseas with relative ease. In our case, capital moves from the core to the periphery. This continues until the rate of profit equalizes, somewhere between the rates of the core and the periphery. The equalization occurs in competitive markets, where capital can move around freely, assumptions that are quite common even in conventional economics. The equalized rate of profit is expressed in terms of prices precisely because it has congealed through the competitive equilibrating process of the market. Importantly, this price rate of profit, distinct from the value rate of profit, is what actually determines the final prices of goods sold. Profit for each industry is therefore the total capital invested, both constant capital and wages, multiplied by this price rate of profit. Total revenue in terms of the final good prices is then the sum of total investment and the profit. Something interesting has occurred. In value terms, both industries produce the same amount of surplus, but here their profits, sometimes referred to by Marx as realized surplus, are not the same. What this effectively means is that in price terms, the products of the periphery are undervalued, while the products of the core are overvalued. To return to Marx, a redistribution of surplus value has occurred via competition, from the periphery to the core. Having looked at both dependency theory and unequal exchange, let's take a step back and consider how applicable these perspectives are. Certainly, the argument of dependency theorists is a powerful and penetrating one, but it rests in large part on the assumption that the periphery is relatively unindustrialized, while the core represents the heart of global industry. This is, to put it lightly, no longer a justifiable assumption. The last few decades of globalization and neoliberalization have been characterized by a massive move of industry from the core to the periphery. The so-called Global South is now the world's factory, and not merely for primary goods. Another crucial development has been the formation of global value chains. In short, the production of any one good, from start to finish, has been split up across numerous parts of the world. The materials for an iPhone are gathered in one part of the world, processed in another, and assembled in yet another. Global value chains reflect the new reality that the majority of commodities are produced, priced, and exchanged on a global level. The underdeveloped world almost always serves as the host of labor-intensive activities in a given global chain of production. Neoclassical economic theory obscures the exploitation occurring in this arrangement by describing the value of a commodity as the sum of the prices of its inputs. This bright value treats the value added by labor in the middle of the production process in its exact price terms, which makes it appear as if the labor of the workers in poor nations adds relatively little in value compared to the R&D, management, marketing, advertisement, and sales conducted in the developed world. Torkil Lausen and Zach Cope depict this view through the smiling curve of value added, where the beginning and ends of the curve show high value added from services and technology of the developed world. The middle of the curve, where the actual production occurs, dips down since the cost of labor, the wages, is quite low. But, as Lausen and Cope show, the Marxist curve for value added is a frown. Most of the value added occurs in production because value itself is the sum of direct and indirect socially necessary labor time that is embodied in a commodity. As we've already seen, however, the products of the underdeveloped world are undervalued in price terms. If we do not believe the myth of mainstream theory that labor productivity is reflected accurately in wages, we see that the more suppressed wages are in the underdeveloped world, the more undervalued the goods of the global south become. This dark value, inspired by the concept of dark matter in physics, constitutes a massive undercurrent driving global commodity chains. It is cloaked by a powerful commodity fetishism that manifests itself on a transnational scale, blinding the consumers of relatively wealthy countries from the reality that they consistently trade an hour of their labor for many hours of labor of their poorer counterparts. Once again, the political elements cannot be forgotten. It is not an accident that this globalization of production occurred concurrently with widespread economic restructuring, wherein imperial institutions like the IMF forced underdeveloped countries to implement policies that promoted competitiveness, code for deregulation and austerity, which have directly damaged the capacity of workers in poor countries to organize. The unpleasant conclusion is that the extraction of surplus value from the underdeveloped regions of the world to the core is uninhibited by national borders and is present in all of our lives on a fundamental level. The capitalism of today is imperialist in its basic function. Moreover, though there is a clear imperial hegemony, led indubitably by the United States, there is little use in assigning imperialist and anti-imperialist badges to nation-states. Imperialism is the structure of globalized capitalism that we live in today, complete with global markets for commodities, wage gaps between regions and countries, borderless circulation of finance capital, uneven development intranationally and internationally, and the institutions that facilitate the reproduction of global capital. The latter may well be closely tied to specific states with historically imperial characteristics, but they are certainly not absent in countries that some people seem ready to label as anti-imperialist solely due to their performative opposition to US or European foreign policy. The newer theories of imperialism do not break from older perspectives entirely, but they do offer us extremely pertinent insights about how capitalism works in our day and age. These insights are invaluable if we really mean to adapt our political strategies to current circumstances, as most Marxists claim to do. We cannot understand unequal exchange in globalized production solely by reading Lenin, astute as he may have been for his time. If we want a functional and relevant theory of imperialism, we need to make necessary additions that capture the new realities of our times. The stakes are nothing short of formulating a strategically viable response to the crises of neoliberalism, climate change, and global inequality.